G'day guys, Tools20 here and welcome back to City Skylines Down Under. It is really good to be back on the Broken Hill map. It has been a while and this project is going to be just a little short project, only about 3 episodes long, as we work on a very small town that's going to be situated just on the outskirts of the city. So this small town is inspired by a whole bunch of small towns that I drove through on the way to the Snowy Mountains a couple of months ago. And the drive is about 6 to 7 hours long. So it's a long stretch of road. You drive through a lot of towns on the way. And I couldn't help but notice so many small towns that lie in between the more major towns that I was driving through. And when you're driving for such a long period of time, all the towns just start merging into the same town feel, you know, like they all sort of become the same style of town. They all sort of follow the same structure. They're only about, less than 1,000 people big. And there seems to always be like a pub and some sort of sporting fields and maybe a school and then, a couple of other little bits and pieces, and that's about it. And they generally also have some sort of petrol station or truck stop or motel or something like that. And after a while, as I was saying, they do really feel like the same town, but then you do notice like little subtle differences to them. So this project is very much focused on the small towns of Australia and trying to capture that feeling within just a small period of time, just the 3 episodes. So of course, if you're Australian and watching this, you're probably going to feel a bit nostalgic and you might recognize a lot of the features that I am plopping down and talking about. Please do let me know. And if you are somebody who is watching this from like the States or from Europe or any of my international viewers, please let me know how similar this town is to towns where you are from, because I am always interested to find out how similar Australia is to other countries, because I have been traveling quite a bit and I do notice like very only subtle differences to Australia and places that I've been to. But I do feel like small towns have just a small town feel no matter where you are in the world. Like I said, a lot of small towns have these truck stops and little small motels and a petrol station, and I don't know if every small town around the world has a pub, but I do know that'll probably be something in the UK or even in Europe. But in particular, this build is primarily based off one town just north of Cooma, a very small town called Bredbo. Shout out to anyone watching this who is actually from Bredbo. It'd be so random if I'm building your town right now, because it is so small. And the reason why I'm building this town is when I was driving through it, we crossed this train line that seemed to be abandoned. And if you follow my channel, you know how much I love abandoned stuff, and if it's an abandoned rail line, then you've got like extra ticks from me. So this whole build is very much based on this abandoned line that just stretches all up and down this highway. It stretches for about 100 or so kilometers. And I really don't know much about it, to be honest. I haven't done much research, except for following the line for as long as I possibly can on Google Maps and just seeing how far it goes and how many towns it stretches through. And the reason why I find this train line so fascinating, though not fascinating enough that I'll do proper research into it. However, I do really love this line because I just totally stumbled across it. I would have never have known about this line unless I drove over its line and saw it going from town to town and find the little remnants of it hidden around the place. So really, this whole build is based on that line, and a lot of what I do over the next few weeks will be placing down more of this abandoned train line and the little remnants of what it used to be like, and connecting it somehow to the Broken Hill story. You do know that we already have an abandoned train line somewhere around this area. I've made sure that I've stayed within the same boundaries of that train line, so it can be somewhat connected, which is quite cool. So that is the general theme for the next few episodes, just working on this train line and a lot of these small towns that are situated all around Australia. And in particular, this episode will also incorporate another feature that seems to be very prominent in small towns, definitely around Australia, and I'm sure around everywhere. And it's these people that seem to just hoard large amounts of trash and cars, and they seem to be in every single town. Maybe it's like because there's more space and they can collect these things. I know that if I had more space and a bigger backyard, I'd probably have more junk laying around my backyard. But I am just always fascinated by the people who must collect these things or gain all these things. We call them hoarders in Oz. I'm sure that's the same terminology around the world. But they fascinate me, and it's very interesting that it's always in these small towns that you get people hoarding such huge amounts of trash. Looks like trash, but I'm sure it's precious materials going on here. And, by the thumbnail and by the title of this episode, my trash collector is going to have a full-blown plane in his backyard. And that might seem very unusual. It is unusual, and maybe it seems a little bit unrealistic. However, this is something that I actually have seen driving to Dubbo many years ago. I did notice somebody who actually had a plane sitting in his backyard amongst other cars and other collectibles, I guess. But I figured, man, that I definitely need to include this in my build somewhere, especially with these awesome Boneyard aeroplanes that Bisqueaklehausen made a few years back for Arrowhead Junction, something that I've actually never used in any of my builds, but always wanted to, so definitely had to use one of those. So probably the plane's too big to be realistic to fit in their backyard. However, the prop is just too good to use. So that is why I have to plop it down. But anyway, that is a lot of rambles about this project, and now I'm glad you guys are all up to date, so I can start talking about what I've been building. And what I did first up was just to map out this whole town and to figure out the structure of the suburbs and the streets. And not much is really going on. It's a very straightforward grid format. And it's all based around just this one road that stretches all the way through the town. And this is just the classic formula for small towns that lie around, these highways and the way that they are structured. I wanted to keep it like that, and I feel like that's probably the most realistic way of actually tackling it. And of course, like I said, there is always some sort of truck stop and some kind of petrol station attached to some of these towns. And I also wanted to include a couple of other things that I do notice with these towns, and that is like some of the takeaway shops that sit around here. So I've got a pancake shop, and I've also got this house that you saw me detail with some arty collectibles and bits and pieces. There's a lot of these shops that sit around these areas, and they seem to just have like a massive collection of bits and pieces from either around the area or craft materials. And I figured if I'm going to be building a small town, I need to include something like that. That is one of the things that you happen to stop at and walk through these shops. They're houses, but they're shops. But you walk in there knowing you're never going to buy anything because it's like always super expensive. There's like keychains for like $12, and you're like, oh, I don't buy keychains anyway. And then there's like arts from around the area, and you're kind of like, I'm not really sure what I'm looking at here. But it's kind of just like an excuse to stretch your legs and to walk around and say you've been and walked around a town, and then you can jump back in your car and off you go. So I wanted to like build on those small little shops, and I feel like it's only natural to have it so close to where tourists are actually stopping off and fill out petrol and stuff like that. And there wasn't really anything too much going around there. I mean, it's just pretty much a dirt road and this motel and just a couple little service station things, and that's about it. And what I'm doing right now is I'm just placing down where I want the houses to sit. So I've been mapping out what the footprints for the houses look like, because they all follow a very classic style, like this grid style, and with like this really big yards. And it was kind of tricky because I didn't actually have any houses. I don't think that any houses really come with a footprint that big, so I had to kind of make these custom fenced areas and place down the houses just individually, which wasn't that tricky once I started doing it, but kind of gave me a bit of a headache when I was figuring out how I was going to make it work. And I pretty much just did one block and just copied it and rotated it and placed it around. And it might look a bit generic at first, but then once you start placing down extra props and trees and all the houses, then they all become quite unique anyway. And the sort of houses that I'm going for, well, I'm going for a real mix of houses. So something that I noticed was that some houses are quite modern around these areas, and then some houses are very old. Some are like the very historical houses, and some of these houses are just these super tiny and very rundown places that sit on these massive yards, and they're, very iconic too around these areas. So I wanted to have a bit of a mix going on here because, this is something that I noticed around Breadbow. Figured I should probably do that too. By the way, you're seeing a lot of drone footage in and out of this episode. That will also be very prominent in the next few episodes too, because I did jump out of my car, I couldn't resist, and I had a bit of a fly and a bit of a wander just to really get a good feel of this area. I was pressed for time because we were heading back home after camping for a few days. And, my poor girlfriend just has to sit in the car and read a book while I fly. So there's only so much time I can spend exploring these areas. I would spend hours, to be honest, even though there's probably not much really to see around here. Once you start exploring these areas and thinking about what you can work on and how I can use these areas as inspiration, then I can wander these areas for hours. So now that I've placed down the bulk of the houses, I can just go through and place down the little bits of detail, just extending some of those yards so that they take up 2 blocks, because I've noticed some blocks will have larger areas where they have some sort of hobby farming going on, or even some cattle, or just have a massive block of land. I did notice that. But generally everyone has a very similar style of land, and they're just doing their own thing on there. Some houses have been totally turfed and are just private residents with families, whereas some of these other houses are actually situated on a small farm that probably would only be somewhat of a hobby farm, or to be selling to local industries and things like that. And there's also blocks of land that are pretty much just cleared and have no residents on there, where, because a lot of these small towns, they're not exactly booming like they used to. So a lot of these towns would actually come about because there was some sort of resource within the area that drew people to this place. A lot of the small towns around New South Wales were established based on the discovery of gold, and Breadbow, though there wasn't a massive gold discovery at Breadbow, around the areas there were quite a lot of discoveries in lots of isolated places, and in particular the Breadbow River. I don't know how close it is to the actual town, but there was gold and there was a mine established there too. So this town was established from the discovery of gold, and I don't think people were really situated at this town, but I think it was more of a hub for people who were traveling from place to place. And I just did a little bit of more research on the actual train line because I couldn't speculate any longer. I'm sure there'll be a whole bunch of people in the comments just proving me wrong for a lot of the things I was speculating. But apparently this train line was established in the late 1800s, and it had a lot of various uses in its time of being operating. For instance, it was used for freight, and it was also used as a passenger service. However, it was abandoned due to a lot of the bridge structures being unsafe, and probably the passenger service wasn't being as used. It probably wasn't really worth its while being open anymore. So it's now closed, and they're looking into potentially opening up the line again. But, that kind of like brings me to my point where, these small towns aren't booming like they used to, and they, the population isn't increasing. It's, and if it is increasing, it'll be very small, but they're generally decreasing. And that's because a lot of people are generally moving to bigger cities or the larger towns within the area. There's quite a lot more opportunities in terms of universities and schools and work. It can be quite hard living in towns like this because, there's only like a couple of industries that would lie around these areas. And, if you already have a farm, or if you're, getting into the business, or if you're, establishing something else, it could be so tricky. So, it kind of makes sense that a lot of people do leave these towns for bigger opportunities. And of course, like, this isn't the case in like 100% of the time, in many other scenarios. I'm making just huge generalizations here. That is pretty much all I'm doing. But like generally that is sort of what happens to small towns, in 2018. In most recent times, people generally are more drawn to cities for these opportunities. However, there are still people who come out to these places for, different opportunities. And I am talking about really small towns. Like Bredbo has a population of 300 people, which is super tiny, we're not talking about regional or rural cities. This is like purely just small town talk. But in any case, these small towns I find still very fascinating, and I love driving through them. I love stopping off and exploring what they have to offer and what makes them so unique. And speaking of unique, I am now finally working on this little house that seems to have gathered a whole bunch of trash. And I say trash because that's what it kind of looks like, but I'm sure that a lot of these places, they collect these items for good reason. And whether it's for scrap metal, or whether they're a collector, whether they sell these items later on down the track, or maybe they're just collecting for a hobby, Perhaps that is just also the case. Like I said, I think if I had more space, if I wasn't inside a city and actually had a proper backyard, I probably would have a lot more stuff than I would. Actually, in fact, I went to university in a rural city where I had a lot more space, and the amount of crap that I collected purely based on the fact that I had a lot of space was ridiculous. So now that I live in the city in a much smaller place, my space is precious, so I'm just not collecting like I used to. And I'm sure that's the case for pretty much anyone. So this man who is collecting all these items, he's also placed them in piles of categorizing them so that they're easy to sort through, because he has so much here. So what he's got some piles of cars and trucks, a lot of other scrap metal as well. There's also a couple of really unique things that he's collected over time. So for instance, there's a fire truck in the back, and a whole bunch of scrap metal from what looks like a camping site, and there's even in the back corner a couple of items from some sort of amusement park. So I would imagine that this man is like somewhat of a collector, because he does have some very unique items. And whether he's bought them in an auction, or whether or not he's salvaged them from abandoned places, who knows? But this is very much based on so many places that I find driving in and out of these places. There is just so many of these people who collect these items, and they generally have just some very unique and very interesting bits and pieces that probably even sparked their their collecting hobby in the first place. So maybe this guy started off with a plane, and then once he got a plane, is sort of like, oh well, maybe I'll collect a couple of other bits and pieces. Who knows? And do let me know if this is very common in your neck of the woods, if you've driven through places like this, or if you know of someone like this, or if you are someone like this. That'll just be amazing. I'd love to love to pick your brains, and I'd love to know why people are collecting so much stuff. What is the use? What is the whole purpose of this? Is it resale? Is it a hobby? I have no idea, but I'm so intrigued. But that is pretty much it for this episode, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this one. I hope you are excited for the rest of the build. We have 2 more episodes yet to come over the next few weeks. And for the next one, we'll be working on that abandoned train line. I fly my drone straight over it, and I get some great shots. And there'll be lots of cutting in and out from drone to builds, because I managed to get that very close. It's a very interesting one, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you guys. But that is it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.